Welcome to the Holmesian Voice, Prologue, The Whispering Lantern. A steady October rain fell over London, each droplet striking the gaslit cobblestones with the precision of a military drum. Even through the sturdy walls of 221B, Baker Street, the peculiar weather made my old war-wound ache with unusual intensity. I had just finished updating my notes on Holmes's recent solution to the curious affair of the Belgian diplomat when Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock interrupted our evening's peace. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, surrounded by a thin haze of tobacco smoke. He had been without a case for nearly a fortnight, and I had observed with growing concern his frequent glances toward the morocco case containing his syringe. The arrival of a visitor at this hour, nearly 9 in the evening, caused his gray eyes to sharpen with interest. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson announced, her usually steady voice carrying a note of concern. "She's quite distressed, poor thing, show her in," Holmes replied, setting aside his pipe and straightening his coat. The woman who entered bore all the signs of recent trauma that my medical experience had taught me to recognize: dilated pupils, slight tremor in the hands, and an elevated breathing rate. Her clothes, though of good quality, were rain-soaked and askew, suggesting she had walked some distance in her distressed state. Holmes's quick glance at her told me he had already deduced far more. "Miss Annabel Carroway," he said before she could speak, causing her eyes to widen. "You've traveled here from Stepney, though you typically reside in a more fashionable district. You're right-handed. Unmarried and employ yourself as a governor, though you've recently taken leave from your PPS position. Most importantly, you're here about your brother's disappearance." She sank into the chair. I offered her composure wavering. "Mr. Holmes, your reputation does you no justice, but how could you possibly have your name embroidered on your handkerchief which bears the mark of a steeply seamstress? Though your face suggests Mayfair sensibilities, the calluses on your right hand are consistent with extensive writing, and the chalk dust on your sleeve speaks to your profession. As for your brother, you're wearing a gentleman's watch chain, recently polished but of an older style, a keepsake I'd warrant. Carried for comfort in his absence." "It was Thomas's," she whispered, clutching the chain. "Mr. Holmes, my brother had vanished and the police dismissed my concerns. He was last seen at an establishment in the East End, the Whispering Lantern." Holmes said, leaning forward to continue. "Thomas was investigating strange occurrences there for his column in the Star, people entering but never leaving, sounds with no source, shadows moving against the light. He called it nonsense at first, but then," she paused, composing herself, "3 nights ago, he went to gather evidence. He had not been seen since, and the police inquired, making notes. The inspector said Thomas had likely found himself in an opium den and would return when his funds ran dry. But my brother is no dissolute, Dr. Watson. He's a serious journalist with a medical degree from Edinburgh." Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally at this detail. "A medical man, you say? That is most interesting, Watson. Your revolver is cleaned and down. Did I trust Holmes? Then we shall visit this establishment tonight." He turned to Miss Carroway, told me precisely what his brother had discovered before his disappearance: notes of accounts from local merchants, strange whispers heard through the walls, lights moving without human agency, the innkeeper. Mr. Blackwood had owned the Whispering Lantern for 30 years, but records show no previous proprietor despite the building's age. Thomas found this suspicious. Indeed, Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin and noted these phenomena did not begin at any particular time. 3 months ago, after Blackwood had some cellars excavated beneath the inn, Thomas believed something had been uncovered during the work. Something that should have remained buried. Inside, Rose donned his coat. Miss Carroway returned home and awaited word from us. Watson, bring your medical kit as well as your revolver. We may have a need for both. The journey to the East End took us through progressively narrower streets where the rain gathered in brackish pools and the gas lamps cast uncertain light through the fog. I observed our surroundings with a military man's caution, noting several figures skulking at the door who seemed to melt away as we approached. The whispering lantern stood at the conjunction of two ancient streets, its weathered facade suggesting a structure far older than its 30 years of documented existence. A tarnished lantern hung above the door, swinging slightly despite the absence of wind. Through grimy windows, I glimpsed movement within. Holmes paused before entering, his keen eyes scanning the building's exterior observed Watson the foundation stones. They're far older than the Chad period, yet this area was marshland until the 16th century. See how the mortar between the lower stones has been recently disturbed, yet no renovation work is evident. Inside, the common room fell silent at our entrance. A handful of patrons huddled over their drinks, avoiding eye contact. Behind the bar, a tall man with a shock of white hair regarded us with open hostility. His right hand remained below the counter, where I had no doubt a weapon lay ready. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume," said pleasantly, approaching the bar. "We've come about Thomas Carroway." Mr. Blackwood spoke and turned. The innkeeper's face remained impassive, but I noticed a bead of sweat on his brow despite the room's chill. "Never heard of him. Strange, as he wrote quite extensively about your establishment." Holmes's voice hardened. 3 months ago, you had work done in the cellars, work that disturbs something quite old, I should think something that's brought you a great deal of trouble. Glass shattered somewhere in the room. The remaining patrons hurriedly departed, leaving us alone with Blackwood. The temperature seemed to drop further, and I could have sworn I heard a whisper not from any human throat echo through the room. "You know nothing," Blackwood hissed. "Leave while you still can." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, I know that beneath these floorboards lies something of great antiquity. I know that Thomas Carroway discovered its nature, and I know that you, Mr. Blackwood, are no simple innkeeper. The calluses on your hands suggest extensive scholarly work by a man more familiar with ancient texts than alcaics." Before Blackwood could respond, an unearthly howl rose from below our feet. The gas lamps flickered, and in their uncertain light, I saw true fear cross the innkeeper's face. "God help us," he whispered. "It's beginning again." "Capital," Holmes exclaimed, his eyes bright with fascination. "Watson, I believe we find ourselves in quite the singular case. Shall we investigate these famous cellars?" As we followed Blackwood toward a heavy door behind the bar, I checked my revolver and medical kit, uncertain which would prove more useful in the hours to come. The whispers grew louder, forming words I could almost, but not quite, understand. For the first time in our long association, I saw Holmes's hand tremble slightly. In Chapter 2, beneath the lantern, the cellar steps creaked ominously beneath our feet as we descended into the darkness. The air grew thick with the musty scent of old stone and something else, a peculiar metallic odor that reminded me of the field hospitals in Afghanistan. Holmes preceded me with his bullseye lamp casting sharp shadows against the damp walls behind us. Blackwood's labored breathing betrayed his mounting anxiety. "Watch your step, gentlemen," Blackwood warned, his scholarly accent more pronounced now that we were away from his public rooms. The excavation left the floor rather treacherous. I noted how his earlier hostility had transformed into a nervous eagerness, the manner of a man desperate to share a burden too long carried. By Holmes, I was certain he had observed this as well. The cellar opened into a series of chambers that showed evidence of recent disturbance. Archaeological tools lay scattered about, brushes, measuring devices, and what appeared to be surveying equipment of a continental manufacturer. Holmes paused to examine these items, his quick eyes noting every detail. "You're rather well equipped for a simple renovation," Mr. Blackwood remarked, lifting a delicate measuring caliper. "German-made, if I'm not mistaken, the same type favored by the British Museum's Antiquities Department." Blackwood's shoulders sagged. "I was a curator there once before I discovered the manuscript." Holmes straightened, his interest piqued. "Now we come to the manuscript." A whisper echoed through the chamber. Closer now, almost comprehensible. The flame in Holmes's lamp flickered, though there was no breeze. "It was in the museum's restricted collection," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to match the whispers around us. "A medieval text describing a Roman temple that once stood here. The author claimed the temple itself was built upon something far older, a place of power dating back to Britain's Druids. When I cross-referenced the location with old maps," he gestured to the surrounding chambers, "I purchased the property and began to dig." "And see what we found?" I asked, my medical instincts noting the man's increased pulse and dilated pupils, classic signs of prolonged stress. Before he could answer, a scraping sound drew our attention to the far corner. Holmes directed his lamp toward it, revealing a passage that had been recently uncovered. The stonework was unlike anything I had seen before, massive blocks fitted together with extraordinary precision covered in markings that seemed to shift in the uncertain light. "That's where he went," Blackwood whispered, "your missing journalist. He came asking questions about the disappearances. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen. He found my research notes and realized what I'd uncovered 3 nights ago. He broke in and went down that passage. I heard the screams, but when I reached the cellar," he shuddered, "only whispers remained." Holmes approached the passage, studying the strange markings with intense concentration. "These symbols are not Celtic nor Roman, Watson. Does your medical training suggest any similarity to ancient medical runes?" I moved closer, my shoulder brushing against the cold stone. The symbols seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, and I felt a curious sensation, like the buzzing one experiences when a limb falls asleep. "Nothing I've encountered, Holmes, though they do produce a peculiar psychological effect." "Step back, Watson," Holmes commanded sharply. I obeyed instantly, recognizing the rare note of genuine concern in his voice. "Mr. Blackwood, your research notes. I assume you kept detailed records?" The former curator nodded. "In my private study upstairs, but surely you didn't intend to venture down that passage." "Indeed, I do, but first, we must understand precisely what we're dealing with. The disappearances you mentioned over the past 3 months. Local workers, mostly. The police dismissed them as typical Eastern vagrants moving on, but then a gentleman went missing, a German archaeologist who'd read my preliminary paper on the site. After that, I sealed off the cellar and tried to prevent further incidents, but Carraway was persistent." Holmes's face took on the intense expression I knew so well, the look of a hunting hound catching a scent. Watson examined the floor before the passage. "Your medical eye may spot details I would miss." I knelt carefully, holding my own lamp close to the ground. Years of investigating crime scenes with Holmes have taught me to be thorough about recent footprints in the dust. Several sets are obscured, but one pair is clear, well-made boots, relatively new. The stride length suggests a man of above-average height, possibly Thomas Carroway. They led me into the passage. But I hesitated, as they did not lead me out. Holmes finished. "Mr. Blackwood, those research notes, if you please, and bring us the writing materials we'll need to transcribe these markings." The curator hurried up the stairs, leaving us alone in the room. The whispers had grown more distinct, and I could almost make out words in a language that hurt my ears to hear. "Holmes," I asked quietly, "what do you make of all this?" My friend was examining the passage entrance with his pocket lens. "A fascinating puzzle, Watson. We have a scholarly innkeeper who discovered an ancient secret, a series of disappearances, and architectural features that defy historical record, not to mention these markings, which appear to have some sort of physiological effect on those who study them too closely. Surely you don't believe in supernatural explanations, my dear Watson? We must not theorize before we have data, though. We'll say this," he straightened, pocketing his lens. "In all my years of investigation, I have never encountered stones that whisper nor symbols that glow without phosphorescent coating. Whatever we are dealing with, it's quite outside our usual experience." The lamp flickered again, and in the momentary darkness, I could have sworn I saw movement within the passage, a suggestion of forms that had no right to exist in our rational world. When the light steadied, there was nothing but shadow. A crash from above made us both start. Blackwood Holmes bounded toward the stairs, taking them two at a time. I followed close behind, my service revolver drawn. The common room was empty. The door to Blackwood's private study was splintered open. Papers were strewn about, and a breeze from the broken window stirred them like the autumn leaves. Of the curator himself, there was no sign. Holmes was quickly sorting through the scattered documents, his expression growing graver by the moment. Watson looked at the pages but was all but unable to read the writing. He handed me a journal, open to a recent entry. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "They're coming more frequently now. The voices grow stronger with each passing night. God forgive me. I should have sealed it up when I had the chance. The old stories were true. There are things in this world that science cannot explain, powers that should remain buried. If you're reading this, stay away from the passage. The missing people. I've seen where they go, I've seen what takes them away, and now I fear it's too late for any of us." The last line trailed off in a desperate scrawl. Holmes was already examining the window, recent damage, signs of a struggle, but no blood. Interestingly enough, he lifted something from the floor, a small brass key on a leather cord. "The plot thickens, Watson. It seems our scholarly friend kept some of his research elsewhere. Surely we should contact the police, but then tell them that an innkeeper had vanished after discovering a supernatural portal in his cellar? No, Watson, this requires a more delicate touch." He pocketed the key and turned to me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "We have a missing journalist, a vanished curator, and a mystery that defies conventional explanation." A whisper cut through the room, clearer than any before. This time I understood the words, though I wished to God I hadn't. Holmes's face paled, telling me he'd heard them too. Watson said softly, "It seems we're expected below. Shall we answer the invitation?" I checked my revolver once more and nodded grimly at whatever horror awaited us in that ancient passage. We would face it together as we had faced so many dangers before, yet as we descended the cellar steps once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far beyond our experience, a mystery that even Sherlock Holmes might find himself unable to solve through pure logic alone. The whispers grew louder, and the darkness before us seemed to pulse with an unholy light. Our investigation into the secrets of the Whispering Lantern was about to take a turn into territory where no detective had ventured before, and I prayed we would live to document what we found. Chapter 3: The Depths Below. As we descended the set of steps for the second time, I found myself cataloging every detail with the heightened awareness that often preceded combat in Afghanistan. The temperature dropped markedly with each step, far more than natural subterranean cooling could explain. My pocket thermometer, which I had begun carrying during our investigation of the coral freezing deaths, registered an impossible decline from 12 degrees Celsius to nearly freezing. Holmes noticed my attention to the instrument's temperature. He asked quietly, "Nearly 0 degrees Celsius, Holmes?" "The rate of decline is remarkably consistent, about 2 degrees per step." "Excellent observation by Watson," he remarked. Checking the barometric pressure, I referred to my second instrument, a habit formed during my military service in areas where sudden pressure changes could signal approaching sandstorms. The pressure was dropping rapidly. "We should be experiencing severe discomfort, yet we feel nothing." Holmes's voice carried that peculiar tight quality it acquired when confronting evidence that defied his rational framework. "Most illuminating." The whispers surrounding us now seemed to emerge from the very stones. Though the words were clearer, they made no more sense than before, a language that seemed to twist through the air like smoke, more felt than heard. My medical training suggested this anesthetic effect should be impossible. Yet I could not deny the evidence of my senses. At the bottom of the stairs, Holmes raised his lamp, illuminating the passage that had claimed Thomas Carroway. The strange symbols on the walls pulsed with a faint bluish luminescence that somehow made the darkness deeper rather than lighter. Holmes approached them with his lens, careful not to touch the stone. "Watson, your medical opinion. Could these markings be causing our physiological responses, some hypnotic pattern perhaps?" I studied the symbols carefully, noting how they seemed to shift when viewed directly. There are documented cases of certain geometric patterns inducing altered states, but nothing that could affect barometric pressure or temperature. I consulted my notebook. The sequence appears to repeat every 7 symbols, though the pattern itself seems to have holes. I exclaimed that one of the symbols had changed while we watched, not through any visible movement but as if it had always been different, though we both clearly remembered its previous form. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The scientific method demands we consider all possibilities, however improbable," he said more to himself than to me. "If we eliminate the impossible." He fell silent, his gray eyes distant with thought. A scraping sound echoed from deeper in the passage. Holmes immediately flattened himself against one wall, gesturing for me to do the same. I drew my revolver, its familiar weight offering little comfort against whatever approached. The sound grew closer, an irregular dragging punctuated by what might have been footsteps, though the rhythm was wrong. A shadow appeared at the far end of the passage, cast by some light source we couldn't see. The shadow's shape. I am a medical man trained in anatomy. I have seen bodies twisted by disease and injury, studied anatomical anomalies that defied classification, but the proportions of that shadow belonged to no living creature I had ever encountered. Holmes's hands gripped my arm, a warning to remain still. The shadow grew larger, and with it came a new sound, a wet sliding noise that made my skin crawl. Just as the thing casting the shadow should have come into view, the gas lamp flickered and died. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard Holmes's sharp intake of breath. Something moved past us, something large and impossibly quiet given its size. The air grew thick with that metallic scent I had noticed earlier, now mixed with an organic decay that reminded me of the moor during London's hottest summer. When the lamp spattered back to life, we were alone in the passage, but on the floor, a trail of moisture led further into the darkness. Where it touched the stone, the ancient symbols glowed brighter. "Holmes," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt, "please tell me you observed something that would explain this rationally." "I observed many things, Watson. Whether they can be explained rationally remains to be seen." He knelt to examine the moisture trail, careful not to touch it. "Tell me, what does your medical experience make of this substance?" I joined him, noting how the liquid seemed to shift colors under direct light. "It resembles no bodily fluid I'm familiar with. The viscosity is closest to plasma, but the iridescence—" I straightened suddenly. "Holmes, it's moving." The trail of liquid was indeed moving, not flowing downhill as physics would demand, but crawling along the floor like a living thing, following the path deeper into the passage. As we watched, it passed over one of Carraway's footprints. The prints simply vanished, as if that section of floor had never held an impression. MMES stood brushing dust from his knees. "We need more data." He consulted his pocket watch. "It's now 11:30, the timing may be significant." Blackwood's journal mentioned increased activity at night. "Surely you don't mean to follow that thing?" "On the contrary, Watson, we're going to return upstairs." I must have looked surprised, for he smiled slightly. "Now, old friend, you know my methods. We have multiple lines of inquiry to pursue, that key we found in Blackwood's study, for instance, and his connection to the British Museum bears investigation. Additionally," he paused, holding his lamp closer to the wall, "these symbols remind me of something I saw in a monograph some years ago. We need to consult my reference library, and the passage will wait. Whatever we're dealing with, it's been here for centuries. A few more hours won't matter." He turned to me, his face grave. "But I suspect we have less time than that regarding Blackwood and Carraway. If they're still alive, we must work quickly." As if in response to his words, a cry echoed from the depths of the passage, a sound that might have been human once. Holmes's hand tightened on his lamp. "Though perhaps," he amended, "we should make one brief exploration before we leave, just to the next chamber." His eyes held a familiar gleam. "After all, Watson, we now have a trail to follow." I checked my revolver again and nodded. We had faced death together many times before, yet as we moved deeper into the passage, following that impossible trail of living liquid, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something far worse than death. The symbols on the walls pulsed in time with our heartbeats now, and the whispers had taken on an almost musical quality, a melody that made my teeth ache and my vision blur ahead. The passage opened into a larger space, and in the darkness beyond our lamplight, something moved. Holmes raised his lamp higher, and we both froze at what its light revealed. There, in the ancient chamber, we found our first real clue to the disappearances, though I would have given anything to remain ignorant of what we discovered. "Good Lord," I whispered. His face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. It seems, Watson, that we now know why no footprints ever led out of this passage. Though I confess I never expected, he trailed off, for once in his celebrated career, seemingly at a loss for words. The chamber before us held answers, yes, but as the whispers rose to a fevered pitch and the symbols blazed with eldritch light, we realized that answers were perhaps the last thing we should have sought in the forgotten depths beneath the whispering lantern. Chapter 4 of the Chamber of Echoes. The chamber before us defied every natural law I had learned in my medical studies. The walls, like those of the passage, were covered in those shifting symbols, but here they formed intricate patterns that seemed to move in 3 dimensions. The ceiling arched upward into darkness, our lamplight insufficient to reveal its height. But it was the center of the room that held our attention. A perfect circle, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, had been carved into the stone floor. Within it, suspended in midair, hung what I can only describe as tears and reality itself, dozens of floating rifts, each roughly the size and shape of a human body. Through these rifts I caught glimpses of different somewhere places that hurt the mind to observe. I managed my voice, barely a whisper during these readings. My instruments had gone mad. The thermometer needles spun continuously, while my barometer had cracked its mechanism, apparently unable to cope with whatever forces were at work. MMES moved forward cautiously, his face illuminated by the otherworldly light emanating from the rifts, noting the law. Watson, the scuff marks. I forced myself to look down, grateful for the familiar territory of physical evidence. Clear signs of struggle marked the stone recent. Among them lay a familiar object, a notebook with its pages spread open. He retrieved it with his handkerchief. Caraway's journal. His sister mentioned his medical background. These notes are quite thorough. I joined him, carefully avoiding the circle's edge. The journal's last entry was dated 3 nights ago, October 17, 1885. The symbols respond to blood. God help me. I understand now why Blackwood kept this hidden. The missing workers. They weren't taken, they were given. Each sacrifice opens another rift, but the pattern is wrong. These fools don't understand what they're doing. The ancient texts in Blackwood's collection make it clear the circle must be completed with 13 rifts aligned with the old stars. But they've opened too quickly. The resonance is building. I could stop. The entry ended in a violent scratch across the page. I said quietly, "Holes, you don't think the evidence suggests otherwise?" Watson observed the OB and the rifts carefully. "Do you notice anything peculiar about their arrangement?" I studied the floating tears. They're moving slowly but definitely shifting position precisely, and their movement forms a pattern that corresponds to these symbols. He indicated a section of the wall where the markings were particularly dense. Cairo's notes mention their rifts aligned with the old stars. I believe we're looking at an attempt to recreate an ancient celestial alignment. A whisper cut through the chamber, closer and clearer than any before. This time I understood more than just isolated words. The meaning made me recoil. "We need to leave now." "Not yet," Holmes said. This alignment, Crow mentioned, it's significant. The position of these rifts. He consulted his pocket watch. "Watson, what phase is the moon tonight?" "Waning gibbous, I believe." 3 days passed, as I thought, and the time is now approaching midnight. He moved around the circle's edge, studying each rift intently. "These aren't doors, Watson, they're windows that are slowly moving into position." A scraping sound echoed from the passage behind us. The same dragging movement we'd heard earlier, but closer now, multiple sets. Holmes quickly pocketed Carraway's journal. It seems we'll have company shortly. Behind that pillar. Quickly. We pressed ourselves against the ancient stone as several figures entered the room. Their movements were wrong, jerky and uncoordinated, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings in the light from the rifts. I recognized one of them as Blackwood. His eyes were open but unseeing, and dark stains covered his clothes. Following him came three more figures, similar to local workers by their dress, probably some of the missing men. They moved to different points around the circle, swaying slightly while I whispered their next. My friend nodded grimly. Each figure bore strange marks around their throats, not bruises or wounds but patterns that matched the symbols on the walls. As we watched, the marks began to glow with the same sickly light as the rift. A new sound filled the chamber, a deep vibration that made my bones ache. The rift started moving faster. And through them, I caught clearer glimpses of what lay beyond. I immediately wished I hadn't looked at the alignment. Holmes muttered, "It's not just the rifts moving into position, the victims were completing a circuit. Watson used your service revolver." Before he could finish, Blackwood's head snapped toward our hiding place. His mouth opened, but the voice that emerged was not his own. The detective. It was said in a language that should have been incomprehensible, yet I understood it perfectly. "We wondered when you would descend. Your reputation extends further than you know, Sherlock Holmes." Holmes stepped out from behind the pillar, his face composed but his eyes blazing. "Then you have me at a disadvantage. You know my name, but I don't believe we've been properly introduced." A horrible sound emerged from Blackwood's throat. It took me a moment to realize it was laughter. Names are such temporary things. We were here before names existed, before your kind learned to scratch symbols on cave walls. Though we do admire how far you've come with symbolism, since then, the other figures had turned to face us. Now, their eyes glowing with the same light as the rifts, the vibration grew stronger, and I noticed with horror that the circle's edge was beginning to smoke. "Fascinating," Holmes said, and I recognized the tone he used in playing for time while analyzing a situation. "You've been influencing human development of written language. These symbols, they're not just a door, they're a program of sorts. Each one alters local spacetime in a specific way." "Clever," the thing using Blackwood's voice said. "Yes, we have been guiding your species towards certain developments, though some, like your missing journalist, discovered too much too quickly. We had to accelerate our timeline." "The 13 rifts," I said, understanding dawning. "You're not just opening doorways, you're breaking down the barriers between worlds." "Hey, the good doctor understands." The boy seemed delighted. "Yes, the barriers grow thin at midnight when the rifts align. Well, perhaps you'd like to stay and observe, we say. Rarely have an audience of your caliber." M's hand moved slightly, a signal we developed over years of facing danger together. I adjusted my position accordingly, remembering the chamber's layout. "A tempting offer." Holmes replied, "But first, I should like to understand the mechanism. These symbols, for instance, they require activation, do they not?" Carraway's notes mentioned blood, fear, pain, all keys that unlock reality's doors. "Your kind provides such." Excellent raw material. Blackwood's head tilted unnaturally. Would you like a demonstration? The other figures began moving toward us, their movements now smoother, more predatory. The rifts pulsed in time with their steps, and through them I saw things reaching, stretching toward our reality. Now, Watson, Holmes shouted. I fired 2 shots at the ceiling where I'd noticed clusters of symbols earlier. The bullets struck true, chipping the ancient stone. For a moment nothing happened, then the symbols flared, blindingly bright, and the careful pattern of rifts should know. The voice emerging from Blackwood rose to an impossible pitch. The alignment. You'll disrupt. The Holmes had already grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the passage behind us. Reality itself seemed to be tearing apart. The rifts began collapsing in on themselves, releasing sounds that no human throat could make. We ran through the passages. The chamber descended into chaos. The symbols on the walls flared and died, plunging us into darkness, broken only by flashes of otherworldly light from behind. Over the cacophony I heard Holmes counting under his breath, 3, 2, 1. A massive concussion threw us forward. Just as we reached the cellar stairs I lost consciousness briefly, and when I came to, Holmes was helping me to my feet. Chapter 5: The Price of Knowledge. The aftermath of our escape from the Whispering Lantern left more questions than answers. While the London papers reported the collapse as nothing more than a structural failure in an aging building, both Holmes and I knew the truth was far more sinister. In the days that followed, I found myself plagued by dreams of those otherworldly rifts and the whispers that seemed to follow us even into the waking world. Holmes, for his part, had sequestered himself in our rooms at Baker Street, surrounding himself with ancient texts borrowed from various academic contacts. The walls of our sitting room had become a maze of papers covered in his precise handwriting, connecting seemingly disparate pieces of information into a web that only he could fully comprehend. "Watson," he called out one morning, exactly a week after our encounter, "what do you make of this?" He held up Carraway's journal, which he had been studying meticulously. The entry from October 15 mentions a resonance pattern in the symbols. I looked up from my own notes, where I had been attempting to document our experience in a manner that wouldn't strain credibility. "Yes, I recall something about the arrangement of the rifts creating a sort of harmony," I replied bravely. "And look here," he pointed to a series of sketches in the margin of the journal. "These patterns match exactly with symbols found in certain Mesopotamian tablets that, according to the British Museum's records, disappeared in 1882 when Blackwood was still curator." "I see," I said, understanding dawning. "Indeed. But here's the curious thing, Watson, those tablets were part of a larger collection, most of which remains in the museum's restricted section. And according to this morning's paper," he tossed me the Times, "3 nights ago, there was an attempted break-in at the museum. Nothing was taken, but the intruder left this behind." He handed me a piece of paper on. It was a single symbol identical to the ones we had seen beneath the Whispering Lantern. "Good Lord, Holmes. You don't think that others are attempting to recreate Blackwood's work?" "I'm certain of it. The question was who and, more importantly, how did they learn it?" Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered, followed by a familiar figure. Miss Annabel was even paler than when we had first met, the dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious distress, "you promised word about Thomas." Holmes's face softened in a way I rarely witnessed. He gestured to a chair. "Please, miss, care to sit down?" I moved to pour her a brandy, recognizing the signs of what was to come. Holmes waited until she had taken a small sip before speaking. "Yes, madam?" he asked. I had no idea how to respond. "Your brother," he began gently, "was a man of remarkable courage and intelligence. His notes may prove invaluable in preventing others from suffering a similar fate. She gripped the glass tightly. Then he is. I regret to say that Thomas Carroway no longer exists in any form that we would recognize. Holmes chose his words with uncharacteristic care. He discovered something that certain parties wished to keep hidden, something that posed a threat to not just London but the entire world. While pursuing that discovery, he made the ultimate sacrifice. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Was it quick? At least. Holmes and I exchanged a glance, both of us remembering the horrors we had witnessed in that underground chamber. Yes, Holmes replied. Lied kindly. It was very quick. He likely never knew what had happened. She nodded slowly, then reached into her reticule and withdrew a packet of letters. These arrived at his lodgings this morning. The landlady brought them to me, but she placed them on the table. I think perhaps you should have them, Mr. Holmes, if they could help prevent others from suffering the same fate. Holmes accepted the letters with a respectful nod. Your brother's research will not be in vain, Miss Carroway, you have my word. After she left, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the packet of letters. Finally, he spoke. Sometimes, Watson, I find myself envying those who see only the surface of our world. To them, a man's disappearance can be explained by mundane tragedy. How much harder it is to accept that there are things in this universe that can erase a human being not just from life but from the very fabric of reality itself. Do you think she suspected the truth? I think she knew enough to be grateful for a comforting lie. He picked up the letters, adding them to his growing wall of evidence. Then, as I was saying, a knock at our door interrupted his speculation. Mrs. Hudson entered again, looking somewhat perturbed. Mr. Holmes, there's a gentleman here to see you, she said. An urgent, rather odd sort of fellow, if you ask me. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Show him up, Mrs. Hudson. The man who entered our sitting room seemed to bring a chill with him. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in expensive but outdated clothes, and in his eyes, I found myself unable to meet his gaze directly. Mr. Holmes, he said in a voice that carried an accent I couldn't quite place. My name is Professor James Moray. I believe we have a mutual interest in certain architectural discoveries. Holmes's posture shifted subtly. I know him well enough to recognize when he was preparing for danger. Professor Moray, your reputation precedes you, though I confess I'm surprised by your interest in archaeology. Oh, I'm interested in many things, Mr. Holmes, including the work of our mutual acquaintance Mr. Blackwood, or rather what he uncovered. Myra's smile never reached his eyes. I understand you recently paid a visit to his establishment. News travels fast, Holmes replied coolly, faster than you might think. Tell me, Mr. Holmes, did you really believe you could disrupt such carefully laid plans without consequences? The alignment may have been prevented. But there are other ways, other places where the barriers are thin. I felt my hand move instinctively toward my revolver, but Holmes gave a subtle shake of his head. I saw Holmes say, and I suppose you're here to warn us off or perhaps recruit us to your cause, but he laughed, a sound that reminded me uncomfortably of the thing that had spoken through Blackwood. My dear Mr. Holmes, I'm here to offer you a choice. Your interference has created quite a stir in certain circles. There are those who believe you should be removed from the equation. I, however, see potential. How flattering, Holmes said dryly. And if we decline your generous offer? Then the next time you encounter those symbols, they won't be in some East End cellar, they'll be somewhere much closer to home. Moray's gaze swept our sitting room. The whispers carry far, Mr. Holmes. Holmes, perhaps you've noticed them in your dreams starting involuntarily every night since our escape. I had indeed heard those whispers in my sleep. Holmes's face remained impassive, but I saw his fingers tighten slightly on his pipe. You have 24 hours to consider my offer, Moray continued. I trust you'll make the wise choice. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Dr. Watson, do give my regards to your sister Harriet. Isn't it such a lovely home she has in Manchester? The threat was clear. After he left, Holmes immediately sprang into action. Pack what you need, Watson. We leave for Manchester within the hour and send a telegram to Morse code word Mesopotamia. He'll understand. As I hurried to prepare, I heard Holmes muttering to himself, studying the papers on our wall with renewed intensity. We had thought our encounter with the supernatural was over, but it seemed it was merely the beginning of a much larger conspiracy. Chapter 6: Echoes of the Past. The journey to Manchester was tense, each passing mile bringing fresh concerns for my sister's safety. Holmes spent most of the trip in silent contemplation, occasionally making notes in a small book I had never seen before. It wasn't until we were approaching the city's outskirts that he finally asked, Watson, what do you recall of your classical education, particularly regarding the oracle at Delphi? The question seemed oddly disconnected from our current predicament. The priestesses were said to have received visions from Apollo, though historical accounts suggest they were likely influenced by gases seeping from fissures in the rock. Yes, Holmes waved impatiently, but the inscriptions. Watson, the symbols carved around the temple entrance, know thyself and nothing in excess, are the famous ones, but there were other lesser-known patterns that visitors reported caused strange effects. When viewed directly, understanding dawned. You think there's a connection to what we saw beneath the whispering lantern? More than a connection. Look at this. He handed me the small book he had been writing in. The pages were filled with careful drawings of symbols, some from the cellar, others that appeared much older. These patterns have appeared throughout history, always associated with sites of supposed supernatural activity, the Delhi inscriptions of certain Mayan temples, caves in southern France containing prehistoric art. But surely those are just coincidences. Ancient peoples often developed similar patterns independently. That's what I believed until I began comparing the mathematical properties of these symbols. Each one corresponds to precise geometric ratios that shouldn't have been known to ancient civilizations, and when arranged into specific combinations, he trailed off as our train pulled into Manchester station. The platform was unusually empty for this time of day, and an unnatural fog seemed to be rolling in despite the clear weather reports I had read that morning. Holes, I said quietly. The air pressure? He nodded grimly. The same phenomenon we experienced in the cellar. They're already here. What? But this time we're better prepared. From his traveling case, he produced several small devices I had never seen before. Maud's department has been developing these ever since I sent word about our encounter. They generate interference patterns that should disrupt the symbolic resonance. Well, we're about to find out, aren't we? He handed me one of the devices, a brass contraption about the size of a pocket watch. Now, let's pay a visit to your sister before our friend, the professor, makes good on his threat. Harriet's house stood in a respectable neighborhood near the university where her late husband had taught mathematics. As we approached, I noticed something odd about the shadows cast by the gas lamps. They seemed to move independently of their sources, stretching toward us like grasping fingers. He saw Watson at the door. He rushed forward, just as they began to coalesce into shapes that defied description. I fumbled with my key, finally managing to unlock the door. Inside, we found the house dark and silent. "Harriet," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty halls. Holmes held up his hand for silence, his keen eyes scanning the shadows of the parlor. He whispered, looking at the floor in the dim light filtering through the windows. I could see faint traces scratched into the wooden floorboards, familiar symbols that made my heart race. They formed a crude circle eerily similar to the one we had seen beneath the whispering lantern. "They're not complete," Holmes observed. The pattern was unfinished. Then, a scream from upstairs cut through the silence. My blood ran cold. I would know my sister's voice anywhere. Watson was waiting and calling, but I was already taking the stairs two at a time, my service revolver drawn. The symbols on the floor began to glow with that same sickly light we had seen in the cellar. I reached the upper landing just in time to see a figure emerge from Harriet's bedroom, not my sister but a man I recognized from the British Museum's Board of Trustees. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and symbols crawled across his skin like living tattoos. Dr. Watson said in a voice that wasn't quite human, "We were on schedule." Before I could respond, Holmes appeared beside me, one of Maud's devices held high. He twisted something on its brass casing, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. The trustee staggered, the symbols on his skin flickering like guttering candles in the bedroom. Watson got her out while I held him. I burst through the door to find a scene from my darkest night. Harriet lay unconscious on the floor, surrounded by a half-drawn circle of those damnable symbols. Standing over her was Professor Moray himself, with a piece of chalk in his hand and a look of cold amusement on his face. The good doctor arrived to save his sister. How perfectly predictable. He made no move to defend himself as I leveled my revolver at his chest. "Tell me, do you really think that weapon will make any difference after what you've seen?" "Step away from her," I growled, "or I will shoot." He smiled, and for a moment his face seemed to shift, showing something else beneath his human features. "Go ahead, I'm curious to see what happens when you disrupt the ritual at this particular stage." From downstairs came the sound of breaking glass and Holmes's voice raised in what might have been Latin. The house trembled, and I heard that same deep vibration we had experienced in the cellar. "You see," Moray continued. "Conversationally, your friend Holmes believes he's terribly clever with his little devices, but he's merely delaying the inevitable. The barriers between the worlds are already weakening. What we began beneath the whispering lantern was just one of many possible gates." "What do you want?" I asked, trying to get closer to Harriet's prone form. "My dear doctor, I want what I have always wanted: power, knowledge, the ability to reshape reality itself. Your sister's house sits at a very particular point of convergence. The symbols here resonate, with others across the city, creating a web of power that..." His lecture was interrupted by a sound that chilled my soul. The whispers had returned. But now they seemed to come from everywhere at once. The symbols around Harriet began to glow, and I saw with horror that they were starting to move, crawling across the floor like living things. "It's beginning," Moray said with something like reverence. "The pattern completes itself, even if your interference was accounted for, factored into the greater design. including the final equation. Holmes burst into the room, his device sparking and smoking in his hand. The trustee was nowhere to be seen. Watson's resonance pattern exponential. The entire city is becoming a focal point of brilliant deduction. Mr. Holmes, Moray sneered, though a bit late, I'm afraid. The symbols are already active. Drawing power from the bylines beneath Manchester, every prehistoric stone circle, every ancient well, every forgotten tomb. They're all part of a vast pattern that has waited for millennia to be completed. As if to emphasize his words, the house shook again through the windows. I could see that unnatural fog rolling through the streets, and within it, shapes that made my mind recoil. The whispers had become a chorus speaking in languages that predated humanity itself. Holmes, however, was smiling that particular smile I had learned to recognize over our years together. It meant he had seen something his opponent had missed, a vast pattern. Yes, he said calmly, but one with a fatal flaw. You see, Professor, in your rush to complete this ritual, you've made the same mistake as poor Blackwood. The symbols must be aligned not just with physical locations but with astronomical ones. Martin's confidence wavered slightly. What are you babbling about? The stars? Professor. The old stars, as Carraway's notes specified, but in your arrogance, you failed to account for stellar drift. The heavens today are not as they were when these symbols were first carved. Your pattern is mathematically unsound. From his pocket, Holmes produced a small brass sphere covered in intricate engravings, another of Maud's devices, but different from the others. This had been measuring the resonance frequency since we arrived. The numbers don't lie, Professor. Your equation is incomplete. For the first time, I saw real fear cross Moray's face. No, the calculations were perfect. The elderly ones themselves confirmed whoever the elderly ones were lying, Holmes said simply. Or perhaps they too failed to grasp the complexity of cosmic mathematics. Either way, he raised the sphere. Watson, get your sister and brace yourself. I lunged forward, grabbed Harriet, and pulled her away from the. On the other side of the barrier, though perhaps not quite in the position of power he had imagined, Holmes straightened his coat. Now I suggest we get your sister somewhere safe. I fear we'll have quite a bit of explaining to do when she wakes up. Indeed, we did have much to explain to Harriet, to Maud's people who arrived shortly after, and eventually to ourselves. The official story, as recorded in the newspapers, blamed the strange events in Manchester on a combination of unusual weather patterns and mass hysteria. But in the weeks that followed, both Holmes and I found ourselves poring over ancient texts with new eyes, recognizing patterns we had never noticed before. The world had changed for us. Or perhaps we had finally begun to see it as it truly was. As for Maria, sometimes in my dreams, I hear whispers that suggest she found exactly what she was looking for. As for the symbols, Holmes assures me that Maud's department has located and secured most of the remaining texts that describe them, most, but not all. And on certain nights, when the stars align just so, I find myself checking the floorboards of our rooms at Baker Street, making sure no strange patterns have begun to form in the wood. For as Holmes remarked during one of our later discussions of the case, in a universe infinite in size, Watson, one must always be prepared for the infinite variety of its horrors and its wonders, a sentiment with which, having seen what I have seen, I must wholeheartedly agree.